Start now. No.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, the expert. My name is Nala. Today, we'll be tackling the topic, the hidden impact of substance use on families and loved ones. Today, we'll be joined by two guests who'll be sharing so much insight on this topic so that we could learn from it. Our first guest is going to be Raylene Patrick. She is a support group leader for families and friends of people who use substances. And our second guest is going to be Mitch Robb. He's a clinical and an educational psychologist. Mitch is working as a managing director for MWell, and he's a registered clinical and an educational psychologist with experience of over 35 years in private practice. His master's research was focused on drug and alcohol treatment programs, and he's been working in the field for since 1987, and he is a society. Throughout his career, he has provided training on addiction, conflict resolution, engaging constructively with individuals struggling with substance use, and including nationwide programs for pharmacy professionals. He has volunteered with the CSVR Trauma Clinic and counseling torture survivors for from France-speaking African countries. And he's also a media commentator regarding on substance use and mental health and addiction recovery. I would like to welcome our guest to today's
Thank you.
conversation. Thank you so much. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So I just want to start with who definitely want to help loved ones struggling with substance use, but the biggest challenge they don't know where to start. What role, Mitch, do family recovery on their recovery journey?
Families are always involved in some way or another, and there's so many different phases to the process that it's very difficult to say, there's no set thing that a family should do. Just one thing on substance use disorders is it's a sliding scale. Some people are at the sort of lower end of the substance use disorder scale, where the substance and their use of it disrupts probably very little. It might harm them and their physical well-being, but it may just vaguely have impact. So somebody maybe gets drunk a bit too often with friends on a weekend. There is still a degree of disorder where families are involved. I guess it depends very much on the extent of that involvement. If somebody is at this more severe end of the substance use disorder scale, then there's enormous impact on families, and families will struggle. There'll be huge impacts on the family. What they can do, I think, is there's so many different things that they can do. Um, I'm not sure if I've answered your question because it's very, I can't in in
Mm.
a few minutes tell you what families should do because there's such a varied problem. Inevitably, families are involved. So to deal with families is a key element of the process of dealing with the substance use disorder.
All right, thank you so much for that. And I just want to bring Raylene into our conversation is that, many people, as a support group leader, many people think that support groups are just only for individuals who are using the substances. Raylene, why would you say that it's very important for family members, right, and loved ones, to have a support group for their own?
Nola, this is a very critical issue worldwide in our communities. Overall, it's critical. So I would say it's not only important for that individual that's struggling with, for example, the addiction or the abuse of substances. It is very important and vital for family members as well to be a part of a support group. I believe that because people who join support groups, for example, it helps to reduce isolation, even for the individual who's actually has the addiction. It definitely reduces isolation. And then if you belong to a support group, you have that support system, where teamwork comes in. You get involved with people. And then I can definitely also relate to the fact that it will always remind you that you are not alone. You're not alone. The minute you step into a support group, when you're ready to, you will see that there's so many other people that's going through the same thing that maybe you thought you're the only one going through that. Support groups will give you that platform to say, I'm not the only one. There's so many other people that can relate to exactly what I'm going through. So it's important to that extent.
And I like the fact that you just said that you are not alone, because in that situation, you can feel like you are alone. And I like that, you highlighted why, the big why, to have support, to be able to support your loved ones. Mitch, with many people, using substances, it doesn't just affect the individual on their own, it affects the family as a whole, right?
Absolutely.
How can you,
I
yes,
was,
and
yeah.
how can it affect a family relationship and the daily functioning and the well-being of those who are closest to this person?
That's such an important question because what happens, if you look at somebody who is on the more severe side of so even a sort of a moderate substance use disorder, the what happens is that in families systems develop. So people play particular roles. They take responsibilities. If it's looking after children, or it might be earning money. There's all sorts of roles and parts people play. When somebody suffers from a substance use disorder, they tend to diminish their role, and the family then compensates for what they're not doing. So if the father is drinking every night, it falls on the mother or an older sibling or an older child to then look after the younger children, or to put the children to bed, to do everything. So there's always a compensatory process that happens, and it's very subtle because people don't automatically just think, oh, this is because he has a substance use disorder. They think, oh, look, he drinks every night, so it's I'll look after the children. And there's an inevitable impact because people will, and families will compensate for the person who is suffering from the substance use disorder. And that can have all sorts of impacts on a family. I mean, and it comes into things like enabling, and often this term enabling comes into the conversation with families enabling. And although it's very rare that somebody would actively enable, because the term enabling almost implies that they mean it, that they're to fault because they're allowing, they're doing it. But actually it's not. It's because they're compensating for the person, that it makes it, because they compensate, then it makes it much easier for the person who's abusing substances to carry on, because all their roles and their responsibilities are being covered by somebody else.
Yeah, thank you for that, and it sounds like it has a huge effect on the family's relationship, because you're trying to compensate for that role. If maybe for the dad, if they're using, then we're trying to compensate on how can we work, it affects the family's relationship in a huge way, and, Raylene, being a support group leader, right? What would be some of the most challenging, what would be the most challenging experiences that people will share when they join their first support group meeting?
I would say one of the most common challenge, if I should call it a challenge, is first of all, when people come, it takes trust, first of all, to approach a support group. But then one of the challenges, I would say, people come in for the first time with, you will definitely see someone is exhausted. You will see that someone is drained. There's even some sense of guilt, some sense of guilt in terms of, was it me? Is it because of me? Why? How did it get to this point? It's also second guessing. Why did this happen to my loved one? And then the not knowing. The first time you walk into a support group, some people take a long time to actually approach a support group because they don't know what's happening, how it works. So you also do find individuals that's very shy. They don't know how to open up about what they've been experiencing. So there's quite a lot of challenges in terms of that. But then at a later stage, you'll experience that people who do approach a support group or join one, they at a later stage become comfortable and you'll see a sense of relief. They open up, they speak about whatever they came, the reason why they came to the support group, and that's eventually where help will come in. So that's basically the challenges around it. And the nicest thing is when you see the relief in people after a certain time when they do receive that help.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think people that are listening in, trust is very important. And, thank you so much for sharing that. What could be one of the biggest challenge that people could face when they join? And, Mitch, I just want to ask, having a loved one that is using, you could always be in constant worry. Where are they? Are they safe? You may also have the worry of if they will relapse, what impact can this ongoing stress have on one's mental health?
It's a very real stressor to, for somebody who has a loved one who's abused, who's suffering from a substance use disorder. You mentioned two things. One is the worry about how they are. If somebody is still using, obviously that concern is a very real concern, because if they're not drinking at home, or if they're drugging away from home, there are a lot of unknowns. There's obviously high risk factors because they might be under the influence of a substance. When you talk about worrying about relapse, that's assuming that they've stopped, and so the worry and the concern when they're using is obviously a very real worry. When it comes to relapse and concern, clearly relapse is part of the condition. It's almost, it defines addiction and substance use disorders, is that, relapses are not unexpected, and it can often be part of the process. But, for a family member, for a loved one, what is important is that they are supportive of the person who's trying to recover from the substance use disorder. So when you look at relapse prevention, there are a lot of measures that people can help the person, because they've actually taken a step in the right direction, and there they need the support, they need the help, they need the encouragement, because it's almost then that there's a reward for remaining clean, for remaining clear of the substance.
Thank you so much. And I like the fact that you're saying that, support goes a long way. And I think, meeting people where they're at, your loved one where they're at, and supporting them on the journey. I think that's a very important word, taking away from what you just shared, that support goes a long way, And, really, I just also want to ask, with family members, what happens when they realize that they are not alone and begin connecting with others who understand them, what they're going through? How does it impact in the support groups?
Nola, like I mentioned earlier, once you approach a support group and you're ready to go, get that help that you need, hope becomes more practical, you know, and then you realize that whatever I'm going through now, right now, or my loved one is going through, this too shall pass. There's hope. And then you also come to the realization that I've stepped into a platform where there will be change. I stepped into a positive environment where there's help and things will change for the better. So um, the sooner someone becomes comfortable and they belong to a support group, I would always say the sooner help will come. So in terms of that, you know, when you gain that, you start gaining that sense of belonging in a support group. And once you in that environment and you feel that sense of belonging, positive changes will
No,
come.
thank you so much for sharing that. Hope, they support,
Definitely.
hope, trust, that we're getting all of that. And those are maybe words that we can work around and can be foundations in families, that people could start talking about and build the foundations in families, to help the family as well as the substance user as well. So I'm glad that we're building these words, that people could take, and it could be a conversation in homes as well. But Mitch, I just also want to ask you, right? What is one of the biggest challenges that families face, knowing that where support ends, right? And where enabling begins? How can families find a difference between the two?
Going back to what I was saying earlier about enabling,
Mm.
I think if family members can understand that process where, in families, systems develop where there's different roles and everybody will play their role. And when a family system develops, which it does in all families, the reason why that system develops is to create calm. So if you look for an example, if one of the parents is abusing substances and the other parent takes more responsibility, the object there is to create the calm. Now, the difference between enabling and supporting, again, I'm nervous about using this word enabling because it almost implies that family members are guilty of something.
Okay.
When in fact they're trapped. They're trapped by that enabling process because if the person who's abusing substances is not taking the responsibility, somebody's got to take that responsibility. Whether it's a spouse or whether it's an older child or whoever it is, somebody's almost trapped into being able to take that responsibility. So I think that's why I know that the net result is that it actually ends up enabling the person. They're not actively enabling and shouldn't feel guilty about the fact that they have now taken responsibility for children. And I think that's a really important step. They shouldn't feel guilty about it, but awareness of how that system is developed is important. So the first step would be awareness. The next step is how can you subtly and slowly change that system so that there's less enabling. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And it depends very much on understanding that family's system. So, it's the support part of it is always important. But I guess if families can work out the difference between support for something which is positive versus support when there isn't something positive. Support when there isn't a reason to support it can be enabling to the person. But if the person, for instance, is really trying to overcome their substance use disorder, then support is key. It's an absolute necessity. And then you're not enabling anything. All you're doing is you're enabling recovery.
No, thank you so much for that. And, I think there's certain words that we should look out for and how we label certain things, to be having understanding. So we are all learning, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation and people are listening in, and, sharing your expertise in the field over 35 years, as well as Raylene as a support group leader. This is very impactful for people that are listening in. Raylene, if somebody's listening in today, right? And wondering where the support group is for me, right? What would you say to encourage them to take that first big step?
Nola, like I said, I don't know if I mentioned it previously, but people need to trust you in the first place, or maybe at least know you. We're using different platforms, on social media to advertise support groups. But then me personally, I would invite people and say, look, come and have a look at how it works, Pop in if we ever sit down support group session, pop in, come and see how, if you feel comfortable to do so, come and have a look at it, listen in. You do not necessarily have to engage at that first time you pop in. Or if you don't feel comfortable coming to a support group, I normally would share, these social media links of different support groups to people to say, look, okay, just log into this, go into this link and listen in and see how you feel about it. If you can relate to the conversations, it always depends on the nature of, So I would always invite people and say, look, it's up to you when you're ready, come in personally when we have support group sessions or go in. And I would share links to say, see how you feel about it. When you're comfortable, you'll start engaging, like I mentioned earlier. Once you're comfortable, you'll start engaging, and then the necessary help you need, you will definitely get it. And then there's another thing that I would like to mention as well is that um, people need to understand. I'm also trying to be very careful with the words that I'm using, but that support groups overall, it does not force any change. Support groups doesn't force any change, but it will definitely make you understand and feel that there is hope. There's second chances out there. There's hope. There's people that's going through the same thing. So that is basically what I'll try and do to convince people to come forward or just speak to someone in order to get help.
Thank you so much. There's a question from the audience I'd like to share is that my loved one has relapsed several times and I'm starting to lose hope. How do other families cope with this and keep moving forward? I would really appreciate for both of you guys. Yes, it's a question yes, I would like the contribution from both of you.
Relapse is part of the disease. If you look at definitions of addiction or substance use disorder, it's a condition where relapse is common. And when I see people who I'm treating for a substance use disorder, I right from the beginning, and I don't tell them this because I'm encouraging them to relapse, but I'm telling them that if they did relapse, I wouldn't be surprised. It wouldn't shock me, nor would I be disappointed or anything, because it's part of the disease. Now, if a family member keeps on relapsing, obviously it's a reflection of how serious the condition is. And again, the support comes when they make an effort to overcome that relapse. And it depends. Sometimes people will just slip, and the next day realize what they've done and, go back on course. And, you could say, well, is that a relapse or is that a slip? And I think just basically to recognize when there's positive movement and reinforce, encourage that, and don't enable or allow the relapse in a sense. I mean, it's not for them to allow it. I know that, but it don't get angry. It unfortunately is part of the disease. And so the encouragement is just to continue with treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Thank
Sorry,
you,
Raylene,
Mitch.
I didn't give you a chance to say anything.
Anyway,
Thank you, Meg. There is a very sensitive issue. Like Mick said, it's part of the disease. There's something that I also wrote down that's also important to understand, that I'm not responsible for their healing. I'm also responsible for mine in the process. So it's a vice versa type of a process that you're going through here. But it's very important to also, like, that is why there are support groups. The support, like Mick said, the support structure is a platform to say, look, come back. There's second chances, you know. Pay attention to the addict. Maybe have a deeper look into what it's not always easy to see why, but pay attention. I would say reach out as much as you can. Invite them all the time. That's what we normally do. Try to find something to keep them busy. There's many ways to try and do it, but I know that it's not easy, and relapsing it's never easy. But there are ways to try and work around that by paying attention to, the addict, and like I said, support group, always try and do something to keep them busy. Like we have a lot of addicts, recovering addicts that I'm very proud of, that reaches out, they do community work. They reach out and also convince and advise where they can, which can also motivate the next person to say, you know what, I actually have it in me, I can do better. So things like that also helps community, outreach and stuff like that.
thank you so much, and I thank you for your time today. And what I'm taking is that as much as we do care about our loved ones that are using, but I think it's also very important that we take care of ourselves. For us to show up for our loved ones, we have to show up for ourselves. And, the importance of using certain words, it's very important. We don't just label, but we use certain words, building trust, from the support group, that what people could get. And also, it was such a great topic, and I wish there was more time for us to talk, so that people could learn, because, it's all a conversation, it's a conversation that people need to have in society. And I really appreciate for your time being here and talking to me, sharing your knowledge. And if there's any additional information that somebody would like to get, they're more than welcome to call SADC on the 0800 12 13 14 number. There are counselors that are there that are willing to assist, or they can go to the SADC website, which is www.sadhe.org.za. If there is any information that they need, there's services, that is their resources, and somebody who's willing to listen on the other side. Thank you so much for being with me today, and I wish you a great weekend. Thank you so much, Mitch, and really. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.